The bedroom door shouldn't have been closed. In 36 years of marriage, it never had been during the day. But when Dorothy Mitchell pushed it open that Tuesday afternoon, coming home early from the pharmacy, she found her husband Richard naked in their marital bed with Marcus Webb the mechanic from across the street. Not in a moment of panic, not scrambling to hide, just there, entangled, skin against skin, beneath the sheets she'd washed 3 days ago. They looked at her without shame. Richard's voice was calm when he spoke. "You're home early." As if she were the interruption. As if 36 years of devotion had just shattered into a million pieces. And all he could think about was the timing. What Dorothy didn't know yet, what would take months of divorce lawyers and sleepless nights to fully understand, was that Marcus wasn't the first. That this hadn't been a mistake. That her entire marriage had been built on a lie so fundamental, so complete, that everything she believed about her life was fiction. This is the story of the woman who spent 36 years living for one man, only to discover she'd been sleeping beside a stranger all along. Dorothy Mitchell had been awake since 5:30 that Tuesday morning in March, just as she had been every morning for the past 36 years. The alarm clock on her nightstand, a wedding gift from her mother-in-law, now long deceased, chirped its familiar tune, and she silenced it with practiced precision before it could wake Richard. He needed his sleep. He worked hard at the insurance office downtown, came home tired, and she had long ago learned that a good wife lets her husband rest. The house on Maple Street in Springfield's West Side had been their home since 1989. A modest 2-story colonial with white vinyl siding and black shutters. It sat among dozens of identical houses in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. The Hendersons lived to the left, the Morales family to the right, and directly across the street. In a house with an overgrown lawn and a pickup truck perpetually parked in the driveway, lived Marcus Webb, the neighborhood mechanic who fixed cars in his garage and charged reasonable rates. Dorothy moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of decades of repetition. She brewed coffee in the old Mr. Coffee machine, the same one they'd bought at Walmart in 1995. She scrambled 2 eggs for Richard, crispy bacon the way he liked it, and wheat toast with just a thin layer of butter. She set out his blood pressure medication next to his orange juice. She ironed his shirt for work, a light blue button-down that brought out his eyes, or at least used to, back when she still noticed such things. At 62 years old, Dorothy had spent more of her life married than not. She'd been 26 when she met Richard Mitchell at a church social in 1980. He was handsome, then sandy brown hair, broad shoulders, a smile that seemed genuine. He worked in insurance, had ambitions, talked about building a future. She was a secretary at a law firm, living with 2 roommates, wondering if she'd ever find someone. When he proposed after 8 months, she said yes without hesitation. Her mother cried with joy. Her father shook Richard's hand and said, "You got yourself a good woman." She believed she had gotten a good man too. They'd tried for children in those early years. It never happened. The doctors ran tests, found nothing conclusive, suggested fertility treatments they couldn't afford. Eventually, they stopped trying. Richard said it was fine, that they had each other, that maybe it was God's plan. Dorothy threw herself into being the perfect wife, instead the role she could control. She cooked elaborate dinners, kept an immaculate house, volunteered at the church, defended Richard to anyone who dared criticize him. Richard worked so hard, she'd tell the ladies at Bible study when they'd mention seeing him at O'Malley's Tavern on a Tuesday afternoon, "He deserves to unwind. Richard's just particular," she'd explain when the neighbors mentioned his short temper, or the way he'd snap at her in public. "He's under a lot of stress." The truth was simpler than she wanted to admit. She'd built her entire identity around being Richard Mitchell's wife. Without that, who was she? This particular Tuesday started no differently than thousands before it. Richard came downstairs at 6:45, sat at the kitchen table, and ate his breakfast while scrolling through his phone. He barely looked at her. "Did you pick up my dry cleaning?" he asked, not glancing up. "Yesterday," Dorothy replied, pouring him more coffee. "It's hanging in your closet." The blue suit. Yes, Richard, the blue suit. He grunted acknowledgement and returned to his phone. This was their morning conversation, transactional, functional, empty of anything resembling warmth. But Dorothy told herself this was normal. This was what marriage looked like after 36 years. The romance faded, the passion cooled, and what remained was partnership. Comfortable, predictable partnership. Richard left for work at 7:15, kissing her on the cheek in that absent way that had become routine. Dorothy watched him back out of the driveway in his silver Honda Accord, then turned to the dishes. She washed them by hand, even though they had a perfectly good dishwasher. It gave her something to do. The house felt too quiet once he was gone. It always did. The silence pressed against her eardrums like physical weight. She'd learned to fill it with tasks: laundry, dusting, reorganizing closets that didn't need reorganizing. Today, she decided to tackle the basement storage room. Spring cleaning, even though spring had barely begun. By noon, she'd sorted through 3 boxes of old Christmas decorations and 2 bags of clothes to donate. Her back ached from bending over, and her knees protested each trip up and down the basement stairs. She made herself a turkey sandwich, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, then remembered she'd forgotten to pick up Richard's prescription at Walgreens. The pharmacy was only 10 minutes away, on Veterans Parkway near the Walmart. She grabbed her purse and keys, called out to the empty house out of habit, "I'll be back soon," and drove to Walgreens in her 80-year-old Toyota Camry. The prescription was ready. She also picked up toilet paper, laundry detergent, and a box of Earl Grey tea, even though they still had 2 boxers. Shopping gave her a reason to leave the house. Dorothy returned at 1:45, earlier than she'd intended. Richard wouldn't be home until 6 at the earliest, sometimes 7 if he stopped for drinks with clients. She had hours to fill. Maybe she'd start dinner prep early. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, Richard's favorite. She pulled into the driveway and noticed Marcus Webb's pickup truck parked on the street in front of their house instead of across the street where it usually sat. Odd, but not alarming. Maybe he was visiting someone on the block. Marcus was friendly enough, mid-40s, divorced, always waved when he saw her. Occasionally helped elderly Mrs. Henderson carry in her groceries. He'd fixed Dorothy's Camry once when it wouldn't start, charged her half what the dealership would have. Dorothy gathered her Walgreens bags and walked to the front door. She unlocked it, stepped inside, and paused. Something felt off. The house had a different quality to it, a presence that hadn't been there when she left. She couldn't articulate what it was, just a sense that the air had changed, that she'd walked into a space that wasn't quite as empty as it should be. She set the bags on the kitchen counter and listened. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Then she heard it, faint, from upstairs. A sound that didn't belong. A low murmur, almost like conversation, but muffled. Maybe the TV. But she hadn't left the TV on, and Richard wasn't home. Dorothy's heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't yet name why. She moved to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The second floor was quiet, but that sound continued for. She was certain now. Male voices. Were they in the bedroom? Her first thought was burglars. Someone had broken in. But why would burglars be talking in her bedroom? Why weren't they rushing to grab valuables? And she climbed the stairs slowly, her hand gripping the railing. Each step creaked under her weight, the old wood protesting after decades of use. The sounds grew clearer as she reached the landing. Not just voices, something else. Breathing, movement, a rhythmic quality that made her stomach tighten with an emotion she couldn't yet identify. The bedroom door was closed. It was never closed during the day. Never. Dorothy stood in front of that door for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Some part of her, the part that had spent 36 years protecting her carefully constructed reality, screamed at her not to open it, to turn around, go back downstairs, pretend she'd never heard anything. But she'd spent 36 years being obedient, compliant, dutiful. For once, she chose truth over comfort. Dorothy turned the doorknob and pushed. The door swung open, and for a split second, Dorothy's brain couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. It was as if she were looking at a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, an image that refused to form coherent meaning. The bedroom, her bedroom, with its floral wallpaper and the wedding photo on the dresser and the cream-colored duvet she'd washed just 3 days ago, had been transformed into something foreign. Richard was on the bed. Her husband of 36 years, the man who kissed her cheek every morning before work. The man she'd defended to neighbors and friends and family, was naked on their marital bed with another person. With Marcus Webb, the mechanic from across the street, the man who'd fixed her car, the man who waved at her when she checked the mail. They were entangled in each other, skin against skin, in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Richard's hands were in Marcus's hands. Marcus's arms were wrapped around Richard's back. They were kissing with an intensity Dorothy had never experienced in her entire marriage. A passion she'd read about in novels, but never witnessed in real life. Time fractured, Dorothy stood in the doorway, frozen, as her brain attempted to reconcile the impossible scene before her with the reality she'd believed in for 3.5 decades. This couldn't be happening. This was someone else's life, someone else's nightmare. She was supposed to be downstairs preparing pot roast. Richard was supposed to be at work. None of this made sense. Then Marcus saw her. His eyes went wide, and he froze. He said something to Richard. Dorothy couldn't hear what, couldn't hear anything over the roaring in her ears. And Richard turned his head. Their eyes met. Dorothy waited for horror, for shock, for shame. For him to leap off the bed, to stammer explanations, to beg for forgiveness, to show some recognition that he'd been caught doing the unthinkable. Instead, Richard just looked at her with something that resembled annoyance, as if she were an interruption, as if she'd walked in on him doing paperwork, not destroying their marriage in the bed they'd shared for over 3 decades. "Dorothy," he said, his voice eerily calm, "you're home early." That was it. No panic, no guilt. Just a statement of fact. Marcus scrambled to grab the sheet, pulling it over himself. He at least had the decency to look mortified. "Jesus, I'm sorry, I didn't." But Richard held up a hand, silencing him. He sat up slowly, deliberately, making no rush to cover himself or hide what Dorothy had just witnessed. His eyes never left hers, and in them, Dorothy saw something that made her blood run cold. Resignation. Not the resignation of someone caught in a terrible mistake, but the resignation of someone who'd been found out after carefully keeping a secret. "You weren't supposed to be home until later," Richard said, as if this were the main problem, as if the timing were the issue rather than the betrayal itself. Dorothy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her entire body had gone numb. Her hands were shaking. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She gripped the doorframe to stay upright. "How long?" she finally managed to whisper. Richard swung his legs off the bed and reached for his pants. Marcus remained frozen on the bed, clutching the sheet, his face pale. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "How long?" Dorothy repeated, her voice stronger now, cutting through the shock. Richard pulled on his pants with infuriating slowness. "Does it matter? Does it?" Dorothy's voice cracked. "Does it matter? You're in our bed with another man, and you're asking me if it matters how long you've been lying to me." "I haven't been lying," Richard said, fastening his belt. "I just haven't told you everything." The casual cruelty of that statement hit Dorothy like a physical blow. 36 years. 36 years of cooking his meals, washing his clothes, defending him to the world, building her entire existence around being his wife, and he'd been living a completely separate life she knew nothing about. Everything? Dorothy heard herself laugh, a high, brittle sound that didn't sound like her. "What is everything, Richard? How many men? How long? Who else knows?" Marcus finally found his voice. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry. This isn't I never meant." "Get out," Dorothy said, her eyes still locked on Richard. "Get out of my house!" Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his clothes and practically ran past Dorothy, not bothering to dress fully before fleeing down the stairs. Dorothy heard the front door slam moments later. Then it was just her and Richard in the bedroom where they'd slept together for over 3 decades. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. Everything looked exactly as it always had: the oak dresser with the doilies on top, the reading lamp on Richard's nightstand, the framed photo of them on their wedding day, but nothing would ever be the same. "You could have at least locked the door," Dorothy said numbly. "You didn't even bother to lock the door." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. For the first time, he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. "I didn't think you'd be home." "That's what you're concerned about? Getting caught?" Dorothy's voice was rising now. Decades of suppressed emotion finally finding an outlet. "Not the fact that you've been cheating on me. Not the fact that you've been lying to me for God knows how long. Not the fact that you made me look like a fool. It's not about you, Dorothy." Those 5 words broke something fundamental inside her. It's not about you. After spending 36 years making everything about him, his needs, his comfort, his happiness, this moment of ultimate betrayal somehow wasn't about her either. "Then what is it about, Richard?" She was crying now, hot tears streaming down her face. "Help me understand. Make this make sense." Richard stood up and faced her. His expression was tired, defeated, but not apologetic. "I didn't choose this. I didn't wake up one day and decide to be attracted to men. I've been this way my whole life." The confession hung in the air between them. "Then why did you marry me?" Dorothy whispered. "Why did you waste 36 years of my life?" "I thought I could change," Richard said quietly. "I thought if I did everything right, married a woman, went to church, lived a normal life, these feelings would go away. I thought I could be what everyone expected me to. And me, what was I? An experiment, a cover. You were my wife." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "You are my wife. I do care about you, Dorothy. This doesn't change that. This changes everything." Dorothy screamed, her composure completely shattered. "Everything we've been together was a lie. Every time you touched me, every time you kissed me, every time you said you loved MIT, was all pretending. I've been sleeping next to a stranger for 36 years. That's not fair." "Fair." Dorothy laughed again, that same brittle, broken sound. "You want to talk about fair? I gave you everything. I defended you when people talked. I made excuses when you stayed out late. I blamed myself when our sex life died. I thought I wasn't attractive enough, wasn't interesting enough, wasn't enough. And the whole time, the problem wasn't MIT, was that I could never be a man." Richard flinched. "Dorothy, no." She held up her hand, suddenly exhausted. "I don't want to hear any more. I can't be in this house right now." She turned and walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, through the living room she'd vacuumed that morning. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter where she'd left it. Her keys were right beside it. She grabbed both and walked out the front door into the bright March afternoon. Mrs. Henderson was in her yard, watering her flower beds. She looked up as Dorothy emerged and waved. Dorothy didn't wave back. She got into her Camry, started the engine, and drove. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove through Springfield's familiar streets, past the Walmart where she shopped every week, past the church where she'd spent countless Sunday mornings, past the library where she volunteered on Thursdays. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning. But Dorothy felt like she was seeing it all for the first time, or perhaps the last time, as the person she'd been for 62 years crumbled away. She ended up at Washington Park, parking near the pond where families brought their children to feed the ducks. She sat in her car and watched the water ripple in the breeze. A young couple walked by, holding hands, laughing at something on one of their phones. They looked so innocent, so unaware that the person walking beside them might be hiding an entire secret life. Dorothy's phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "We need to talk about this." She turned off her phone. She sat in that parking lot until the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink. She watched families pack up their picnic blankets, watched joggers finish their evening runs, watched life continue normally for everyone except her. When the park lights came on, Dorothy finally started her car and drove to the one place she could think to go, her sister Margaret's house in Chatham, a suburb just outside Springfield. Margaret was 3 years younger, divorced herself, and had always been the more pragmatic of the two sisters. Margaret took one look at Dorothy's face when she opened the door and pulled her inside without asking questions. She made tea, sat Dorothy down at her kitchen table, and waited. And Dorothy, for the first time in 36 years, told someone the truth. Dorothy didn't sleep that night. She lay in Margaret's guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as car headlights passed outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, Richard and Marcus, tangled together in her bed. On sheets she'd washed, beneath a duvet she'd carefully selected at JCPenney 8 years ago. The image had burned itself into her retinas, impossible to unsee. Margaret had been kind, but direct. After listening to Dorothy's tearful confession, her sister had said exactly what Dorothy needed to hear, but didn't want to. You know, you can't go back to that house and pretend this didn't happen, right? You know, this changes everything. Dorothy had nodded. But part of her part that had spent 36 years being Richard Mitchell's wife still wanted to believe there was a way to fix this, to salvage something from the wreckage. Because if her marriage was truly over, then who was she? What had her entire adult life been for? The next morning, Wednesday, Dorothy borrowed Margaret's phone to check her messages. She'd turned hers off and left it that way, unable to face whatever Richard might have texted. But reality couldn't be avoided forever. 15 missed calls from Richard, 23 text messages, 7 voicemails. Margaret sat beside her as Dorothy listened to the voicemails on speaker. The first few were apologetic. Richard's voice strained. "Dorothy, please come home. We need to talk about this. I know you're upset, but running away won't solve anything." By the fourth message, his tone had shifted. "You're being dramatic. Yes, you caught me in a bad situation, but we're both adults. We can work through this." The seventh message, left at 2 in the morning, was different entirely. "Fine. Stay at Margaret's. But this isn't just on me, Dorothy. You think you're the perfect wife, but you've never really seen me. You've spent 36 years seeing what you wanted to see. Maybe if you'd paid attention, actually looked at me instead of just playing house, this wouldn't have been such a shock." Margaret reached over and deleted the message. "He's trying to make you feel guilty. Don't let him." But the words had already found their mark. Had Dorothy been willfully blind? Had there been signs she'd ignored? She thought back over the years, Richard's lack of interest in physical intimacy, his frequent late nights that he blamed on work, the way he'd sometimes flinch when she touched him unexpectedly. She'd attributed it all to stress, to age, to the natural cooling of a long marriage. But had she simply not wanted to see the truth? "Stop," Margaret said firmly, reading Dorothy's expression. "Whatever you're thinking right now, stop. He lied to you for 36 years. He used you as a cover for his real life. You don't get to blame yourself for not detecting lies you had no reason to suspect." Dorothy wanted to believe her sister, but the guilt was already taking root, joining the shame and anger and grief that swirled inside her like a toxic storm. By Wednesday afternoon, Dorothy knew she couldn't hide at Margaret's forever. She needed clothes, her medications, important documents. She needed to face the house that no longer felt like home. Margaret offered to go with her, but Dorothy declined. This was something she had to do alone. She drove back to Maple Street at 3 in the afternoon, when she knew Richard would still be at work. Or at least, she thought he'd be at work. At this point, she wasn't sure she knew anything true about her husband at all. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway. Dorothy let herself in through the front door, and the house greeted her with familiar smells: the lavender air freshener she bought at Bath & Body Works, the lingering scent of the coffee she'd brewed yesterday morning. It felt like years ago now, that normal Tuesday morning when she'd scrambled Richard's eggs and ironed his shirt. blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to implode. Dorothy moved through the house like a ghost, gathering items in a daze. Clothes from her closet, her medications from the bathroom cabinet, her laptop from the home office. She was packing a suitcase in the bedroom, trying not to look at the bed, failing miserably when she heard the front door open, heavy footsteps on the stairs. Richard appeared in the bedroom doorway, still in his work clothes. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his tie loosened. "You came back," he said, "just to get my things. So that's it. You're leaving?" Dorothy continued folding a sweater with shaking hands. "What did you think would happen, Richard? You thought I'd just forgive and forget? I thought we could talk about it like adults." Adults. Dorothy spun to face him. Adults don't sneak around behind their spouse's back for God knows how many years. Adults don't, her voice broke. "How long? With Marcus?" Richard leaned against the doorframe. 3 years. 3 years. Dorothy's knees went weak. She sat down hard on the edge of the bed. 3 years. You've been sleeping with our neighbor for 3 years, and I never knew. What else, Richard? How many others? Does it matter? Yes, Dorothy screamed. Yes, it matters. It matters because I've spent 36 years of my life with you. It matters because every single thing I thought was true about my marriage was a lie. So yes, Richard, it matters. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus wasn't the first. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. There were others, Richard continued, his voice flat. Over the years, mostly brief encounters, men I'd meet at bars in other cities when I traveled for work. Nothing serious until Marcus. Dorothy felt like she was falling through space with nothing to grab onto. Our entire marriage. Not the entire, yes, Richard. The entire marriage. Dorothy stood up, rage finally overwhelming the grief. From the beginning, you were using me. You married me to hide who you really were. I was your cover, your beard. That's what they call it, right? The woman who makes a gay man look straight. It wasn't like that, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what was it like? Explain it to me. Make me understand how you could look me in the eye every single day. Accept my devotion. Let me defend you to everyone. Let me blame myself for our failed sex life. And not once tell me the truth, because I was terrified. Richard shouted, and for the first time, Dorothy saw real emotion crack through his facade. Do you know what it was like growing up gay in the 80s? In a conservative family? In a small town where everyone goes to church on Sunday? I watched people get disowned by their families. I heard the slurs, the jokes, the hatred. My own father said he'd rather have a dead son than a gay one. So yes, I lied. I built a life that would protect me, and you were part of that life. I was a person, Richard. A human being with feelings and dreams, and a life I gave to you. I wasn't a prop in your survival story. I know that, Richard said quietly. I do know that, and I'm sorry. But I can't change what I am. I can't change what I've done. You could have been honest, Dorothy said, tears streaming down her face again. At any point in 36 years, you could have told me the truth. We could have gotten divorced quietly. I could have rebuilt my life while I still had time. But you stole that from me. You stole 36 years, and now I'm 62 years old, and I have to start over with nothing. This house is half yours. Our savings are joint. You won't have nothing. The practicality of the statement felt like another betrayal. I'm not talking about money, Richard. I'm talking about my life, my youth, my chance to have real love, real partnership. You took all of that and used it to maintain your comfortable lie. Richard said nothing. What could he say? There was no defense, no justification that would make any of this acceptable. Dorothy zipped her suitcase. I'll have a lawyer contact you about the divorce. Dorothy, wait, no. She picked up the suitcase and walked past him to the door. I've waited long enough. 36 years. In fact, I'm done waiting. She made it to her car before Richard called after her from the front porch. What are you going to tell people? Dorothy stopped, her hand on the car door. She turned to look at him, this man she'd spent more than half her life with, this stranger who wore her husband's face. "The truth," she said. "I'm going to tell them the truth." The truth spread through their neighborhood like wildfire. Dorothy didn't have to say much. Marcus Webb's panicked flight from the house in broad daylight, half-dressed, had been witnessed by Mrs. Henderson and her nephew, who'd been visiting that day. Mrs. Henderson told the Morales family, who told the Johnsons, who told everyone at their book club that Thursday night. By Friday morning, Dorothy's phone, which she'd finally turned back on, was flooded with messages. Some were supportive, friends from church offering prayers and solidarity. Others were simply curious, thinly veiled attempts to get details about the scandal. And a few were cruel, suggesting that Dorothy must have known, must have been complicit somehow, or, at the very least, must have done something to drive Richard to it. That last category stung the most because part of Dorothy wondered if they were right. She was staying with Margaret while she figured out next steps. Margaret had insisted she shouldn't be alone, and Dorothy was grateful for her sister's fierce protectiveness. But even with Margaret's support, Dorothy felt herself fragmenting, breaking into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. On Saturday, Dorothy forced herself to go to the grocery store. She needed food, needed to maintain some semblance of normal routine, needed to prove to herself that she could still function in the world even as her life fell apart. She chose Schnucks on West Wabash Avenue, a store where she was less likely to run into neighbors from Maple Street. She was wrong. In the produce section, carefully selecting apples, Dorothy heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't Dorothy Mitchell. She turned to see Diane Ramirez, a woman from her church Bible study group. Diane had a reputation for gossip, and the gleam in her eyes confirmed that she'd heard about Richard. "Hello, Diane," Dorothy said quietly, turning back to the apples. "I heard about Richard," Diane said, making no attempt to lower her voice. Other shoppers were glancing their way now. Such a shock. Though I have to say, I always wondered about him. He never quite seemed like the marrying type, if you know what I mean. Dorothy's hands tightened on an apple. "I should get going. How long did you know?" Diane asked, and there was accusation in her tone. "Come on, Dorothy. You can't tell me you didn't suspect something. All those late nights? All those business trips?" "I didn't know," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Really?" Diane's skepticism was palpable. "You lived with the man for 36 years and never noticed. Or did you just not want to admit it? I mean, a lot of women choose to look the other way when their husbands—" "I didn't know," Dorothy repeated, louder this time. Several shoppers had stopped pretending not to listen and were openly watching now. "I trusted my husband. I believed him when he said he was working late. I believed him when he said he loved me. I believed all of it because that's what you do in a marriage. You trust your partner. So no, Diane, I didn't know. I didn't suspect. And the fact that you think I should have, that you think this is somehow my fault, says more about you than it does about me." Diane's mouth opened, closed. She clearly hadn't expected Dorothy to fight back. "I wasn't trying to blame you. I just think I don't care what you think," Dorothy said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "My marriage is over. My husband betrayed me. I'm going through the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And if you can't offer compassion, then please just leave me alone." Dorothy grabbed her purse and walked away, leaving her half-filled cart behind. She made it to her car before the tears came, sitting in the Schnucks parking lot, sobbing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. This was her life now: public humiliation, whispered judgments, people who thought they knew her story but understood nothing. Margaret found her an hour later, still sitting in the parking lot. Dorothy had called her, unable to drive safely in her current state. Margaret drove them both back to her house in Chatham, and that night, over tea at Margaret's kitchen, Dorothy made a decision. "I need to leave Springfield," she said. Margaret set down her mug. "Leave? Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere I can start over. Somewhere people don't know me as Richard Mitchell's wife or that woman whose husband left her for a man. Dorothy's hands trembled around her own mug. I can't rebuild my life here, man. Everywhere I go, I'll be reminded of what I lost. Everyone I see will know what happened. I need a clean slate. You're talking about running away. I'm talking about surviving, Dorothy corrected. Staying here feels like drowning slowly. I need air. I need space. I need to figure out who Dorothy is when she's not Mrs. Richard Mitchell. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, I understand. But promise me you'll see a lawyer first. Make sure you get what you're entitled to in the divorce. Don't let Richard off easy just because you want to leave quickly. Dorothy nodded. Margaret was right. She needed to protect herself, even if part of her just wanted to run and never look back. The following Monday, Dorothy met with Catherine Chen, a divorce attorney Margaret had recommended. Catherine's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel. And Catherine herself was younger than Dorothy, probably early 40s, with sharp eyes and an efficient demeanor. Walk me through what happened, Catherine said, pen poised over her legal pad. Dorothy told the story, hating how sordid it sounded when reduced to facts. Caught husband in bed with neighbor, 36-year marriage, no children, jointly owned house, shared savings account, and he's admitted to the affair. Catherine asked. Yes, he said, it's been going on for 3 years, with Marcus, but there were others before him. Catherine made notes. In Illinois, we have no-fault divorce, which means you don't have to prove wrongdoing to end the marriage. However, the fact that your husband engaged in adultery could impact the division of assets if we can demonstrate that marital funds were used to support the affair. I don't care about punishing him, Dorothy said quietly. I just want out. I want to split everything fairly and move on with my life. That's admirable, but my job is to make sure fairly actually means fairly. Not that you give away half your retirement because you feel guilty or traumatized. Catherine leaned forward. Mrs. Mitchell, you gave 36 years to this marriage. You deserve to walk away with the financial security to build a new life. Over the next several weeks, Dorothy learned just how complicated divorce could be. There were documents to gather, accounts to assets to list. The house on Maple Street would need to be appraised. Richard's pension would be divided. They'd need to split their savings, their retirement accounts, even the furniture in their home. Richard, to his credit, didn't fight. He agreed to mediation rather than a contentious court battle. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps he simply wanted it over as quickly as Dorothy did. They met in Catherine Chen's conference room on a Wednesday afternoon in late April. Richard with his own lawyer, and hammered out the terms of their divorce. They barely looked at each other. After 36 years of marriage, they sat across a table like strangers, dividing up the pieces of a life that had been built on lies. Dorothy agreed to let Richard keep the house if he bought out her half of its equity. They'd split their savings 50-50. His pension would be divided according to the years they'd been married. It was all remarkably civil and completely devastating. Is there anything else we need to address? Catherine asked as they wrapped up. Dorothy looked at Richard for the first time that afternoon, really looked at him. He'd lost weight, she noticed. There were more gray hairs than she remembered. He looked older, sadder, but also somehow lighter, as if the burden of pretending had been lifted. Why didn't you just leave? Dorothy asked suddenly. If you were so unhappy, if you knew you were gay, why did you stay married to me for 36 years? You could have divorced me any time. You could have been free. Richard met her eyes. Because I was a coward. Because staying was easier than admitting the truth. Because I told myself that as long as I maintained the appearance of normal, I wasn't actually lying. I convinced myself that what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you. He paused. I was wrong about all of it, and I'm sorry, Dorothy. For what it's worth, I genuinely am sorry. Dorothy nodded slowly. I believe you are. But sorry doesn't give me back the life I lost. Sorry doesn't make me young again or give me back the years I wasted. Sorry is just a word, Richard. I know. There was nothing more to say. They signed the mediation agreement, shook hands with their respective lawyers, and left. Dorothy walked out of that office building into the bright May sunshine, a single woman, for the first time in 36 years. Dorothy moved out of Springfield in June, with her share of the house equity and half their savings. She had enough to start over, not luxuriously, but comfortably. Margaret had a friend who owned a small apartment building in Bloomington, about an hour north of Springfield. It was far enough to feel like a fresh start, but close enough that Margaret could visit easily. The apartment was tiny compared to the house on Maple Street, just a one-bedroom with a narrow galley kitchen and a living room barely large enough for a couch and TV. But it was hers. For the first time in her adult life, Dorothy lived in a space that was entirely her own, decorated to her taste, organized by her rules. She hung pictures she liked without asking anyone's opinion. She bought a comfortable reading chair that Richard would have hated. She painted the bedroom a soft lavender that made her smile every time she walked in. The first few months were difficult. Dorothy woke up most mornings feeling purposeless. She'd spent so long defining herself by her relationship to Richard, cooking his meals, doing his laundry, managing his schedule, that without those tasks, she didn't know what to do with her time. She'd wander her small apartment, make herself tea, stare out the window at the street below, and wonder if this was all her life would be now, waiting out the years in solitude. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. It started with small things. Dorothy discovered she liked sleeping in. For 36 years, she'd dragged herself out of bed at 5:30 to make Richard's breakfast. Now, on mornings when she didn't have anywhere to be, she stayed in bed until 8, sometimes 9, luxuriating in the quiet and the softness of her sheets. She realized she liked vegetarian food. Richard had insisted on meat at every dinner, scoffing at her occasional suggestions of meatless meals. Now Dorothy experimented with new recipes: pea curry, roasted vegetable pasta, hearty lentil stew. She discovered flavors and combinations she'd never tried before. She started walking. Bloomington had lovely parks and tree-lined neighborhoods, and Dorothy fell into the habit of taking long walks in the early evening. When the summer heat had faded to something bearable, she walked without purpose, without destination, just for the pleasure of moving through the world untethered. And eventually, hesitantly, she started connecting with people. There was a community center near her apartment that offered classes for seniors. Dorothy had never thought of herself as a senior, but at 62, she technically qualified. She signed up for a watercolor painting class on a whim, having never painted in her life but needing something to fill her Tuesday evening. The instructor was a woman named Linda Caravaggio, probably 70 years old, with white hair in a messy bun and paint-stained overalls. She had the kind of energy that made everyone around her feel more alive. "You've never painted before?" Linda asked during Dorothy's first class, examining her tentative brushstroke. "Never," Dorothy admitted. "I'm not sure I'm any good at it." "Good is relative," Linda said, dipping her brush in cadmium yellow. "The question is, does it make you happy?" Did it make her happy? Dorothy considered as she mixed colors on her palette, trying to capture the shade of a sunset she'd seen the previous evening. She wasn't sure yet, but it made her feel something: engaged, present, curious. That was more than she'd felt in months. By September, Dorothy had completed 6 watercolor paintings, all of them mediocre by any objective standard, but somehow precious to her. She hung them in her apartment, these imperfect representations of her new life. She also joined a book club that met at the community center on Wednesday afternoons. The group was mostly women, ranging in age from mid-50s to late 70s, and they read everything from literary fiction to mystery novels to memoirs. Dorothy loved it. She loved the discussions, the different perspectives, the way books gave her windows into lives completely unlike her own. It was at book club that she met Patricia Newman, a 65-year-old widow who'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years prior. Patricia had a directness that Dorothy found both intimidating and refreshing. "You have that look," Patricia said to Dorothy one afternoon, as they packed up after discussing a novel about a woman's journey across America following her divorce. "What look?" Dorothy asked. The look of someone who's been through hell but is determined to come out the other side. Patricia smiled. I had the same look after Frank died. It gets better, you know. Not easier, exactly, but better. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. Does it? Because most days it feels like I'm just going through the motions. Like I'm pretending to be a functional person, but really I'm just hollow inside. That's grief, Patricia said matter-of-factly. You're grieving the life you thought you had, the future you believed in. That takes time to process, but eventually not all at once. But gradually you'll realize you're actually living again, not just going through motions. You'll have a moment of genuine laughter or real joy, and you'll think, oh, I'm still here. I'm still capable of feeling good things. Patricia became Dorothy's first real friend in Bloomington. They started meeting for coffee weekly, then going to movies together, then taking day trips to nearby towns just for the pleasure of exploring somewhere new. Patricia had a sharp wit and a refusal to take anything too seriously, qualities Dorothy desperately needed. Through Patricia, Dorothy met other women who were rebuilding their lives after Los Suidos divorcees, women who'd never married, women who'd left difficult situations and started over. They formed an informal support network, getting together for potlucks and game nights and birthday celebrations. For the first time in decades, Dorothy had friendships that were hers, not extensions of Richard's social circle or church obligation. By October, Dorothy realized she needed more than hobbies and friends. She needed purpose. She'd left her job as a legal secretary when she married Richard, and at 62, she wasn't sure anyone would hire her for traditional employment. But she had skills, organizational abilities, attention to detail, decades of experience managing a household like a small business. She found a part-time position at the Bloomington Public Library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. The pay was modest, but Dorothy didn't need much. More importantly, the work made her feel useful. She liked helping people, liked being part of a functioning institution, liked having a reason to get dressed and leave her apartment 3 days a week. Her supervisor was a woman named Robin Sy, 30 years younger than Dorothy, but kind and patient. You're really good with the older patrons, Robin observed one afternoon, as Dorothy helped an elderly man find large print mysteries. You have a calming presence. I guess I've had practice being patient, Dorothy said, thinking of all those years catering to Richard's mood. Well, it's appreciated here, Robin said warmly. You're a valuable part of our team. A valuable part of the team. Such simple words, but they meant everything to Dorothy. She mattered. Not as someone's wife, not as a support system for someone else's life, but as herself. Winter in Bloomington was cold and gray, but Dorothy found unexpected comfort. She liked the quiet of snowy mornings, the way the world felt hushed, and she liked coming home to her warm apartment after her library shift, making herself soup, curling up with a book while snow fell outside her window. Margaret visited for Christmas, bringing her adult daughter Sophie, and they had a lovely, low-key celebration in Dorothy's small apartment. Margaret remarked on how different Dorothy seemed, more settled in herself. You look good, Margaret said as they washed dishes together after Christmas dinner. I mean actually good. Not just holding it together good. I feel okay, Dorothy said slowly. Not happy, exactly, not yet. But okay, like I'm building something real, instead of living in someone else's construction. I'm proud of you, Margaret said, squeezing Dorothy's hand. What you've been through would have destroyed a lot of people. But you're still here, still fighting, still showing up for your own life. In January, Dorothy's divorce was finalized. She received the paperwork in the mail, official documents, declaring that her 36-year marriage had legally ended. She sat with those papers at her kitchen table for a long time, experiencing a complicated tangle of emotions: relief, grief, anger, sadness, and underneath it all, a strange sense of freedom. She was no longer Dorothy Mitchell. She'd taken back her maiden name, Dorothy Keating. The name felt unfamiliar after so many decades, like a shirt she'd worn in her 20s that no longer quite fit. But it was hers. It belonged to no one but herself. That evening, Patricia came over with a bottle of wine. "We're celebrating," she announced. "Celebrating what?" Dorothy asked. "My divorce?" "Celebrating your freedom," Patricia corrected. "Celebrating the fact that you survived something that would have broken most people. Celebrating you, Dorothy Keating, whoever you decide that person is going to be." They drank wine and talked late into the night. Patricia shared stories about her own journey after Frank's death. The depression, the anger at the unfairness of it all, the slow climb back to joy. Dorothy talked about her fears for the future, her uncertainty about who she was without the identity of wife. "You know what I've learned?" Patricia said as they finished the bottle. "Life doesn't give us do-overs. We don't get to go back and make different choices, pick different partners, live different lives. But we do get to decide what comes next. The past is written, the future is still blank page, and you get to choose what goes on them." Those words stayed with Dorothy in the weeks and months that followed. The past was written 36 years, with Richard, the betrayal, the humiliation, the divorce. Nothing could change what had happened. But the future was blank pages, waiting for her to write something new. By spring, Dorothy had been in Bloomington for almost a year. She'd settled into routines that felt sustainable. Her library job 3 days a week, watercolor class on Tuesdays, book club on Wednesdays, coffee with Patricia on Fridays. She'd decorated her apartment with her own paintings, photographs from her walks, plants that thrived in her care. She'd built a life that was modest but genuine, small but entirely hers. One warm April evening, Dorothy sat on the small balcony of her apartment with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over Bloomington's rooftops. She thought about Richard, something she did less and less frequently now, but occasionally still. She wondered if he was happy, if he and Marcus were still together, if he'd finally found the authenticity he'd been hiding for so long. She felt, not forgiveness, exactly. The wound was too deep for that, the betrayal too profound. But she no longer felt consumed by anger. The rage had burned itself out over the months, leaving behind something closer to sad acceptance. Richard had stolen years from her. That was true, and it would always be true. But he hadn't stolen her capacity for joy, her ability to grow, her fundamental resilience. She'd discovered those things in herself over the past year, qualities she hadn't known she possessed. At 63 years old, Dorothy Keating was building a life from scratch. Some days were still hard. Some mornings she still woke up feeling the weight of loss, the unfairness of having to start over so late in life. But increasingly, there were days when she felt genuinely okay. Days when she laughed with friends, lost herself in a good book, felt proud of a painting she'd completed, or simply appreciated the warmth of sunshine on her face. She'd survived the worst things she could imagine. She'd walked through fire and emerged scarred, but standing. And now, finally, she was learning to live not in the shadow of who she'd been, but in the light of who she was becoming. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Dorothy pulled her cardigan tighter against the cooling air and smiled, a small, quiet smile, but genuine. She was going to be okay. Not because the past didn't hurt. Not because the betrayal had been forgiven or forgotten, but because she'd chosen to keep going, to keep building, to keep showing up for her own life. And in the end, that choice, that simple, daily decision to survive and eventually to thrive, was the greatest revenge she could have imagined. Not revenge against Richard, though part of her took satisfaction in knowing she'd built something real without him. Revenge against the voice that had told her she was too old to start over, too damaged to heal, too ordinary to matter. She'd proven that voice wrong. Dorothy Keating was 63 years old, divorced, starting over, and finally living for herself. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.